Afternoon, everyone. My name is Anya Prusa. I work with the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I've heard that Hurricane Florence is due to arrive in Washington later this week, but I think for those of us in the city, it already feels like we're in the eye of the storm. And Brazil, this election cycle, has been no different. In the last 2 weeks alone, we've seen in the news the National Museum fire, the stabbing of a presidential candidate, the Superior Electoral Court's decision to block the candidacy of a former president, the denial of his various appeals, and new corruption allegations against several other candidates. With less than a month to go before the first round elections in October, the outcome still seems highly uncertain. One constant theme, however, has been the role of women in this election. Most attention has focused on whether female voters, 52% of the electorate, will decide the outcome of this presidential race. Far more women than men remain undecided. Women have shown a much higher rejection rate of far-right candidate and current frontrunner Jair Bolsonaro. Marina Silva, the only viable female candidate for the presidency, has openly targeted her campaign at female voters, but all of the candidates are attempting to win over this group of the electorate. Yet I think this election also tells a deeper story about the role of female candidates and politicians in Brazil at the federal, state, and local levels. Brazilian electoral law requires 30% of each party's candidates be women. Yet before this election cycle, female candidates were often left without the organizational support, television ad time, and financial resources offered to male candidates, and these are critical to electoral success. In Brazil, women currently hold just 12% of seats in the National Congress. They hold just 11% of elected positions across Brazil at federal, state, and local levels. The World Economic Forum last year ranked Brazil 110th out of 144 countries on political empowerment for women. And this year, the Interparliamentary Union ranked Brazil 152nd for female parliamentary representation. That's behind Iraq and Afghanistan. New requirements that 30% of campaign resources be spent on female candidates may make a difference come October, but Brazil clearly has room for improvement. I am pleased to be joined today by 3 experts on this important issue. First, Malu Gattu, who is currently a scholar at the Wilson Center and will soon join University College London as an assistant professor of Latin American politics. Next is Kristen Wiley, assistant professor of political science at James Madison University, who just released a book on party institutionalization and women's representation in democratic Brazil. And joining us via Skype is Pedro dos Santos, an associate professor of political science at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. You can read their full bios in the handout. After the presentations, we'll have time for a Q&A session, so start thinking of your questions. And Malu, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. If I could get the clicker. So from what I understand, we're going to go around in a couple rounds. So I'm going to start my presentation by just giving you an overview of what's going on in Brazil right now in regards to the elections, and especially focusing on women's voters, and then we'll go. Each one of us is going to focus on slightly different topics. But as Anya mentioned, we're holding elections. The first rounds are going to come on the 7th of October, so it's getting really close. And these are elections for president and vice president, 2/3 of the Senate seats, all seats of the Chamber of Deputies, all governors and vice governor positions, and also state and district legislatures. It's a total of over 1,600 seats overall around the country. And these are also elections where the role of women have been very prominent in the media and for candidates as well. People have started to realize that women are important. And multiple news outlets have talked about it, even posing that perhaps this is the election of women. So one of the things that the question that we really want to answer today is what's going on in regards to women's role in these elections, and how will their role play out in terms of candidacies and voters as well. But before I get into voters, I just wanted to provide you some context about why these elections can also be understood from a gendered lens. So first, these are the first elections, general elections, coming after the impeachment of Brazil's first female president. And the impeachment process in and of itself was a gendered process. So on the one hand, here you have Dilma, and on the other hand, over there, you have many congressmen on the day of the voting on the impeachment, and they're holding signs that say "Ciao, querida," which the literal translation would be "Goodbye, honey." And that is one of the very light ways in which this process can be characterized as gendered. But the fact that Dilma was a woman was very prevalent in the media in characterizing her and her failures in office. The second thing to note is that there is high distrust in political elites, in institutions. The president currently only boasts a 4% approval rate, and there are high levels of distrust in all institutions in government, but especially in the executive and Congress. And the third thing to note is there are so many men in Brazilian politics. Only 10% of seats in the lower chamber are occupied by women, but that's not, as Anya mentioned, unique to the chamber. All levels of government and so from the federal level to state and municipal levels, most offices are overwhelmingly occupied by men. And the final thing to mention is that now we're coming up to the 6th-month anniversary of the assassination of Marielle Franco, who was a city councilwoman in Rio, and who was not only a woman, but a Black woman from the favela who was lesbian. And so her assassination, by everything points to state actors due to her work in investigating human rights violations, was or has been interpreted as a very clear signal as to who belongs and does not belong in Brazilian politics, but also about her image as someone who was perhaps challenging the traditional white male space of politics in Brazil. And so that's really important to understand what's going on in terms of the renewal, the demands for renewal, and the kinds of candidates that are presenting themselves in these elections as well. Okay, so let's get to the presidential race. Pedro's going to get more into it, but I just wanted to introduce you some of the candidates so that I can speak a little bit about voting behavior. So Lula, who was Brazil's former president, as Anya mentioned, he was leading the polls until his candidacy has been rejected by the Electoral Court. Lula is currently in jail, but still, until the 20th of August, which was the latest poll that included him, he was taking a very strong lead. He's the candidate from the Workers' Party, and now that he can't be a candidate, even though they're still appealing, but I mean, it doesn't look like he's going to be a candidate. The person who takes his spot is Fernando Haddad, former mayor of São Paulo. The second person who was leading the polls and now is the leader of the polls is Jair Bolsonaro, and he's a far right-wing candidate who has been known to issue racist, sexist comments very openly. And so that also has shaped the ways in which voters have behaved in terms of the main candidates of this election. And then we have 3 other candidates that are more or less tied, even though it seems that Ciro, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, he seems to be gaining a bit more votes in the latest polls, but we'll get to it. But as Anya mentioned, again, the only female candidate we have viable in this election is Marina Silva, who's a centrist candidate. But basically, since the elections, the candidacies have resumed and campaign has started on the 16th of August, what we've started to notice is that a lot of voters were undecided, partly because of this high levels of distrust in traditional political elites, but that there was a gender gap in terms of how undecided voters were coming along. And so, for instance, while 44% of women were undecided as late as the 20th of August, that was 30% for men. So candidates realized that they really needed to start targeting women. And partly is that women are the majority of voters. So women represent 52.5% of voters in Brazil. Also, women might be less likely to support Bolsonaro. And so other voters, especially the ones that are getting tight there, Marina Silva, Ciro, and Alckmin, those are the ones that are fighting for these voters. And also that it really matters to capture even just the difference in the proportion between women and men is relevant for the second round of elections. So in Brazil, for the presidential race, we basically have generally 2 rounds. It's very rare that a president would get 50% of the votes, right, in the first round. If no one achieves 50% of the votes, it goes to the second round with the 2 most voted candidates. And so this is really where we're at. It's now that Lula isn't in the race, the 4 candidates that are sort of trying to fight for their spot in the second round, besides Bolsonaro, are trying to get to women voters. And one of the strategies that they have done to do so is to actually change their campaign strategies to very directly speak to women. And so, for instance, Ciro Gomes, who has, even though he is a left-wing candidate and now the most viable, perhaps, left-wing candidate, he has been or has had this voters have perceived him as sexist. In the past, when he was running for president in the past, when asked what would be his wife's role in the presidential palace, he said, "She would sleep with me." That didn't go very well. And so up to this day, there is this weight of him being perceived as a sexist politician. And so he's been trying to change that, has been focusing a lot on talking about domestic violence and femicide, which are huge problems in Brazil. About 12 women are killed from femicide every day in the country. And so that's a very prominent item on the policy agenda. And so he's been talking a lot about that. Marina Silva has also run for office before, but this is the first time that she has emphasized so much her identity as a woman. And so in her first campaign spot, she starts the spot with saying, "I want to talk to you, woman," and goes on to talk about her own experiences as a woman and the kinds of discrimination that she has encountered and why she would be the best candidate to tackle those types of discrimination. Alckmin, who is the traditional right-wing candidate from the PSDB, his first campaign spot was actually getting directly to Bolsonaro, and he was showing clips from the far right-wing candidate disrespecting women, and the spot ends with him saying, "Those who do not respect women shouldn't have the respect of women." And Bolsonaro himself, as I mentioned, the far right-wing candidate, has been also tackling women in his own way by saying that one of the ways to get rid of domestic violence issues or femicide would be to arm women so that they would be stronger in the household, I guess. Anyways, so that's all going on. And on the 1st of September, the Electoral Court rejected Lula's candidacies. And now we get to the point in which the PT hasn't yet nominated or formally nominated Haddad as the candidate, and now they're being more and more forced to do so. On 4th of September, another poll came out in which Lula was not mentioned as a candidate. And here, between the 20th of August and the 4th of September, you already see that there is a sharp decrease in the number of undecided voters, but women are still much more likely to be undecided than men. So you have 32% of women versus 22% of men still undecided. But you also see that there are very different patterns of support between men and women, and this is the first time in which we see this drastic difference between men and women in terms of their voting behavior for president in Brazil. So you see that Bolsonaro does very well with men. 28% of men actually have the intention of voting for Bolsonaro. In this latest poll, in the poll from the 4th of September, Bolsonaro actually is also the front runner among women, having 16% of vote intentions, but you still see that there is a high difference between men and women here. So on the 6th of September, Bolsonaro was stabbed. So as Anya said, like, things are moving on really quickly in Brazil. There was a lot, and it's been hard to even follow polls and everything that's going on. So he was stabbed, and some say that this will give him an electoral advantage or an electoral boost, and we're already seeing signs of this. So there was a smaller poll that was conducted over the weekend after his stabbing, and it already puts him at a 30% vote intentions. And there's a lot of, talk on social media and et cetera that does suggest that this might have given him an electoral advantage. And so what we do think is that, for me, in my opinion, there's no way that he's not going to go to the second round of elections. I think it's very unrealistic to think that there is any way that two other candidates would be able to displace him and in this time, in less than a month now. The other question that was up in the air was about whether or not Lula would be able to transfer votes to Haddad, to the extent to which he would make it to the second round. And here, one of the considerations was that Lula's biggest share of support was among women, especially poor women from the Northeast, and it doesn't seem like the votes transfer that well. Ciro Gomes had a bit of a boost, especially among women in this latest poll. And so it's looking more and more that the people who might go to the second round of election might be Bolsonaro with either Marina or Ciro. And there is a poll that is more extensive that's coming out today, and that will be the poll that's going to come out that doesn't include Lula, and that is being done after after Bolsonaro got stabbed. So we'll have a better idea of what's going on once this poll comes out today. But one of the things that I wanted to mention before I pass on to Pedro and Kristen is that the presidential elections aren't the only elections that are going on. And if the impeachment taught us anything, is that congressional posts are really important. And I'll talk about this in my sort of like second round of talks, but I'll pass on to Pedro for now. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me here today. So I'm going to discuss some of the general aspects of election, paying special attention to the presidential ticket and historical analysis, the role women play in executive politics. So, in this very chaotic campaign season, we are seeing a largest number of women running as vice presidential candidates, the largest absolute number of women as part of the vice presidential ticket. And now things become, oh, sorry. Yeah, and I'm having a little bit of issue here with the microphone, right? So I'll slow down a little bit. Largest absolute number of women as part of the presidential vice presidential ticket, and what now seems like the normalization of women as candidates in presidential elections in Brazil. So this is the fourth electoral cycle in a row that we see at least two women running as presidential candidates. The third consecutive electoral cycle we see Marina Silva running, right? And once again considered a contender. And so this is kind of an interesting kind of normalization that we see women, and it's expected to a certain extent to have women in these elections. Among the 7 women running as on a presidential ticket this year, 3 have extensive national political experience, and their candidacy shows that parties and coalitions are nominating women for Brazil's most powerful position, and that vice presidential candidacies are likely to be used in a strategic way and not just as the tokenization of women candidates. We'll see a little bit more of that in the governors. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But Marina Silva is a former senator, a former cabinet member, is the current candidate for Sustainability Network, which is a party that she helped create. Ana Amélia is the vice presidential choice for Geraldo Alckmin of PSDB. She's currently a senator for the Progressive Party, and when Alckmin, going back with what Malu have said about bringing the woman vote, when Alckmin announced the candidacy, he said, emphasized the fact that Ana Amélia is a woman, saying that the more women participate in politics, the more Brazilian society has to gain. And then lastly, Cátia Abreu of PDT, also a senator, gave up her gubernatorial run in Tocantins, a race that she would likely have won, to become Ciro Gomes' vice presidential candidate. So there is, it seems to me, and we can, on the Q&A we can talk more about this. It seems to me there is like an actual use of these women in a strategic way to try to bring more votes to the ticket. Which is, again, these negotiations happen. The presidential, vice president in elections in Brazil do play a major aspect in terms of the coalition building. So, this also showed the strength of powerful women in these parties being part of this coalition building project as well. So, the inclusion of women as candidates for Brazil's highest elected position is a stark difference today than what we saw in 1989, the first election of the democratic era, where there were 23 men running for office and no woman included in any of the tickets. In 1994, we saw Elias de Araújo for the PMDB as a vice presidential candidate. Ticket placed fourth in the election, but wasn't expressive enough, only 4% of the votes. In 1998, there was Teresa Ruiz for PTN as a presidential candidate, and Carla Rabelo of the Green Party, and Nancy Pilar of PTDB. None of these candidates was expressive enough. The parties weren't expressive enough. They combined for less than 1% of the votes, right? Then in 2002, we have the first attempt of cultivating the woman vote to a certain extent with a vice presidential nomination. Rita Camata of PMDB was José Serra's vice presidential candidate. José Serra was one of the contenders for that race. Camata was the first lady of Espírito Santo state before becoming a four-term federal deputy. So she had her own bona fides by the time she was nominated as a vice presidential candidate. And according to media outlets at the time, in 2002, nominating a woman for the vice president to the vice presidency influenced the party's decision to choose her as Serra's running mate. If you look back at the news article, there was a lot of negotiations at the time to decide who was going to be the vice presidential nominee. And in the end, José Serra's choice of Camata played a factor too. But in the end, having a woman really mattered. Michel Temer is quoted saying that the fact that she was a woman and the fact that she has a quote unquote good image were factors in this decision. The good image really meant that she was good looking, right? Several articles discussing her nomination at the time made direct allusion to her looks, calling her a beautiful woman, young and beautiful, the muse of the 1988 Constitution, because she was one of the federal deputies at the time, and calling the ticket the Beauty and the Beast, right? So there were some interesting gender connotations in this first time where a viable woman was the vice presidential candidate. So this was the first attempt to cultivate the woman vote by nominating a woman to a viable presidential ticket. The coalition received 23.19% of the votes in the first round and almost 40% in the second round. It was a strong coalition. It was a follow-up to Cardoso's presidency. So there's not any research to try to gather this the impact that she had on the woman vote. But at this time, it seems that there was not a whole lot of a connection there. There were other two candidates at that time. PSTU had a candidate, vice president candidate, but again, inexpressive parties with less than 1% of the vote. In 2006, Heloísa Helena of left-leaning PSOL was also, who was also at the time the president of that party, was the third highest voted presidential candidate with 6.86%. Again, this was the era of the PT-PSDB presidential campaigns, where even the third place candidate was not expressive enough for the second round. The Progressive Republican Party at the time, a very small party as well, ran what was the only all-woman ticket in Brazil with Ana Maria Rangel and Delma Gama. But again, they received 0.13% of the vote. Again, just not really women not being put in positions to win necessarily, right? So, as Malu mentioned a little bit, in 2010, we had, the election of Dilma Rousseff and Marina Silva, now with the Green Party, receiving almost 20 million votes in the first round. So in the end, over 2/3 of Brazilians voted for a woman as a presidential candidate in Brazil, which is impressive, again, thinking that we have 10% of women on average in most political positions. PSTU also had a vice presidential candidate, but again, 0.08% of the vote, not really expressive. But it's still, there is this the symbolic aspect of it, of having women involved, and I think PSTU in the end is an interesting case because they really bring women forth early on. As kind of going back to what Malu said too, both in 2010 and 2014, gender was used by Dilma Rousseff in her campaign quite a bit. Marina Silva, we did not see a whole lot of discussion of gender specifically during her campaign. And Luciana Genro in 2014, who placed in fourth place for PSOL, also included strong women's rights agendas in her campaign as well. So I think you see an evolution of trying to cultivate the woman vote in a more direct way. And today, this election, we see that very specifically, also because of this, almost in a way, a reaction to some of the sexist narrative that we're seeing too. So. So 2014, although Marina Silva was actually supposed to be a vice presidential candidate, Eduardo Campos of the PSB, which is a left-leaning party, died in a plane crash, and then led to Marina Silva become the presidential candidate. And it was around this time during the election that when this happened. I had to remember this too because Marina Silva at one point polled higher than Dilma Rousseff during the campaign. So polls, especially in a volatile environment, can only predict so much, right? And then as slowly she lost some of the support, ended up not even making to the second round. But there was definitely a surge. I'm thinking about Bolsonaro stabbing. There can be a surge in votes there that may actually level out or go back down as we get closer to the election. But again, this shows once again that over 2/3 of Brazilians voted in the first round for a woman to hold the Brazil's highest office, right? So, so this year we have 2 women as candidates. Marina Silva will try it again, and Vera Lucia from PSTU. This means that PSTU had 4 women in the last 5 elections in the ticket, right? So again, kind of showing that this is a left-wing party. And they, in a way, they have more of an open discussion about gender issues, like inside the Workers' Party, inside PSTU, PSOL, the more left-leaning parties we have, PCdoB as well, right? In 2014, the campaign process changed drastically with the death of Eduardo Campos and the ascension of Marina Silva. Like this year, we're seeing an even more complicated and convoluted campaign. Lula's candidacy was rejected, with now the stabbing of Bolsonaro. So we'll like another election with volatile polling prior to the election that may or may not be able to tell us a whole lot until like the very last week, right? Without Lula, Fernando Haddad is poised to become the PT's presidential candidate. And this way, Manuela Dávila from the Communist Party will become his vice presidential candidate. And there was a very, very strong discussion because Manuela was going to run as the PCdoB's presidential ticket. And there was a very strong and difficult behind-the-scenes negotiation between the Workers' Party and PCdoB to have her kind of like as the hold on, everybody, in a way, the Workers' Party knew that Lula wasn't going to be a candidate, so they had to have a contingency plan. So Manuela was kind of the contingency vice presidential candidate from the very beginning, right? As early as it is to determine the success of the 2018 candidates, we see Ciro Gomes up there, and Marina Silva as well. So thinking about this, of the 5 coalition and parties polling above 5%, all but Bolsonaro's party have a woman in the ticket, and that counts for 40% of likely voters with a woman on the ticket, either as the main candidate or as a vice presidential candidate. The number of women running in viable tickets in 2018 shows this interesting scenario, right, for women in politics in Brazil. Dr. Wiley will talk more about women in the legislatures, but we briefly discussed this already, that Brazil struggles to elect women to legislative positions and to even local executive positions. But the Brazilian voter has shown at the national level that they will vote for a woman if they feel that they're the best candidate. So it's very likely that the decision to run a woman as vice president, specifically in the case of Ciro Gomes, Cátia Abreu, Geraldo Alckmin, and Amélia, and Haddad and Manuela to a certain extent as well, are an attempt to cultivate the vote of Brazilian women in Brazil, of women in Brazil. Jair Bolsonaro now has a 42% rejection rate among women voters as of August, as the last poll that I could find. And to my knowledge, there's no research in the Brazilian context that addresses the relationship between vice presidential candidates and the cultivation of the woman vote, so women as VPs. In the U.S. context, there was some studies analyzing the McCain-Palin campaign, and there was no correlation between having a woman as a vice president candidate and a significant increase in the woman vote share. Again, context is a different context with a different presidential election, but it's interesting to kind of think about this and look at this in Brazil. After this year, we definitely have to revisit this idea of can women, vice presidential candidates transfer votes to a certain extent to the big ticket. So I wanted to talk briefly about state and municipal and gubernatorial elections. Just very briefly here for women in the municipal elections. Again, same number, 11%, hovering around 11% of women mayors. The number is lower in state capitals where there's more budgetary power and more political power. And there's a higher proportion of women elected to as mayors in smaller municipalities. So again, there's still like a gender kind of strategy for parties to put women in positions of more power, that the party could get more power in terms of both budgetary and also just political trading power. So similar thinking in gubernatorial elections. This position yields considerable budgetary and political power, and women have not fared very well. The number of women elected has never been more than 3 or 11% of the positions. And candidates tend to hover around 3 or 4 for every election cycle. Women have been tapped for vice governorships more often, including a surprising jump this year. So this year, almost 40% of all vice gubernatorial candidates are women, while the average in the last 3 elections was around 25% of women as vice governors. One explanation for the rise of vice gubernatorial candidates and possibly even vice presidential candidates relate to the 30% quota party fund that I think Dr. Wiley will talk a little more detail possibly. We can also talk about this in the Q&A as well. It's reported in the last 3 weeks that some parties interpret the law as allowing the 30% fund that is now just for women to be used in any woman candidacy. That may have influenced their decision to nominate women as vice governors to be able to allocate this public funds into gubernatorial campaigns. So far, the electoral courts, the state electoral courts, are indicating that the funds must be used specifically for women running in positions where the gender quota also applies. So this rise in vice governor candidates may be another example of parties trying to skirt electoral rules that have been aimed at increasing women's presence in politics. But again, another development that we're going to have to see this year to see what clear impact both this new adjustment to the quota law and also how parties find a way to either abide by it or find ways to not continue to not give women a clear position in power. So, just really briefly, I want to talk about the women in policymaking specifically. So, as I think you have the slide up now, the picture of Dilma Rousseff's first cabinet and Temer's first speech as president. You see a clear difference in terms of the number of men and number of women that are available there. On a superficial level, these 2 pictures show the difference between Rousseff's cabinet and Michel Temer's current cabinet, right? In the case of Brazil, the rise of women cabinet members was also was very significant during Rousseff's tenure. She nominated more women to cabinet positions than any previous democratic elected president in Brazil, including the appointment to ministries considered important to the Workers' Party in her administration. Nevertheless, Rousseff was never able to reach the 30% women cabinet members she promised after her 2010 election. We have a research co-authored by the 3 of us that explore in more detail the determinants of cabinet appointment in Brazil, the importance of cabinets in coalition and negotiation and governability, and the impact these dynamics have on the appointment of women to cabinet positions. We can definitely talk more about that on the second round as well. So in conclusion, this is an interesting year for women in presidential elections, right? There's a lot of them there, but we need to see if it's going to be more the same or if this is actually an attempt to bring more women to power and also increase the number of women in elected positions. Thank you.
Previously, yes, thank you. We're real keen to emphasize that Congress matters too. So we'll be talking a little bit more about the congressional seats in this presentation. So since 1995, Brazil has had a gender quota law, first implemented in the 1998 congressional elections, that requires parties to put forward 30% women. That law was a lei que não pega, or a law on paper only, for several years, and it was not until 2010, after the law was reformed to enable enforcement, that electoral courts started to enforce the gender quota. Yet it was enforced unevenly across the states. The electoral administration is highly decentralized in Brazil, and so we see significant variation from state to state. In 2014, we see the first real earnest enforcement of the gender quota. And so in the years when the quota was first in place, from 1998 until 2008, on average, I think it was 16% of state party lists reached the 30% target for women. So the norm up until this point was basically quota neglect. Once the electoral courts started to enforce the gender quota, parties were scurrying to try to find women candidates. And so you often heard, in interviews that the three of us have conducted, that party leaders would say, oh, we couldn't find women that were interested in running. And so a significant piece of our research has been trying to ask why there was this kind of reluctance. And what we would often see is that at the final hour, when these the candidate lists were due to the electoral courts, the state parties would realize, oh no, we don't have any women, or we haven't met the 30%. And there was this last-ditch effort to try to get people to put on the list. And so it would be whoever was in the room at that time, hey, can I put your name on the list? And so we see that as they started to enforce the quota in earnest, there are all these ways in which the parties are kind of maneuvering around that requirement. So not only kind of putting candidates up, at the last minute, but in some cases, parties were actually falsely registering women's candidacies without their consent. So there are instances of parties stealing Facebook profile photos and registering women's candidacies to appear as though they have met the candidate quota. And so the basic takeaway point here, looking at the gender quota, is that this is an instance of formal institutional change that parties have found ways to kind of maneuver around. And so just because the written rules of the game may specify inclusion doesn't mean that the actual practices on the ground do so. And so we see that even in 2014, when these were actually enforced and around half of state party lists met the 30% target, nearly a third of state parties didn't advance a single female candidate to the Chamber of Deputies, and there are 513 seats open up for grabs, and so they run not a single one. And we've also demonstrated in research that Malu and I are working on that around half of those female candidates were what we have classified as laranjas. And so these are kind of false candidates or phantom candidates. Some of them would be the incident of kind of non-consensual candidacies. In other instances, we see that they are, maybe complying. So you'll see an instance of a woman maybe putting her name on the list with the understanding that she wouldn't run the campaign, but in the next election, she maybe would get support from the party. So it's this kind of strategic decision to put their name on the list with no intention of campaigning at all. And so we see again that even as there's been this push to kind of increase the representativeness of Brazil's formal political sphere, parties are always finding ways to get around such mandates and trying to preserve the status quo. Right, so we find that the parties that are most likely to comply with the quota are those parties that are institutionalized, so they have a strong organizational structure, they have clear political platforms and ideas. This is in contrast to more weakly institutionalized or inchoate parties that lack a clear platform, that are more rooted in personalist politics, that often are electoral vehicles, that lack a coherent organizational structure, often lack the kind of internal offices that would allow women the chance to kind of cut their political teeth within the party before going up for election. And so in the book that we mentioned before that I've just released, I talk a little bit more about how this works and why parties that are stronger and that include, critically, more women in their state leadership structures are best positioned to comply with the quota, to recruit women, and to support their candidacies in viable ways. So this kind of background, about the gender quota is important. Another critical piece of the puzzle are intensely gendered and race disparities in access to campaign funds. So historically, candidates for the Congress have depended, and throughout other offices as well, have depended deeply on corporate sources of finance. And so looking to candidates to the Chamber of Deputies from 1994 to 2010, we see that among winning candidates, about half of their revenue is coming from corporate sources. And we know that access to campaign finance is one of the most significant predictors of electoral performance. We also know that there are profound race and gender disparities in access to wages. And so if money speaks, those that don't have money can't speak as loudly. And so one of the interesting developments lately has been the 2015 ruling that corporate finance was unconstitutional. And so we see, a mad just scramble by elected officials trying to figure out where they're going to get the revenue to run their campaigns. And so in 2017, Congress approved this Electoral Fund of $1.7 billion coming from the state coffers to fund electoral campaigns. So the basic, one of the basic ideas of having access to public resources for campaigns is that it can serve to level the playing field, is particularly in the wake of discrepancies in wages and whatnot. But what we've seen with this electoral fund is that parties have total discretion over how to allocate those funds to their candidates. And so there is one provision that the Electoral Court recently stated that the parties have to give at least 30% of that fund to female candidates. And so there's this anticipation that, at last we'll have kind of a leveling of the playing field. But we're not holding our breath. We'll see how it plays out. What we've seen thus far is that given that parties are, have total discretion over how they will spend the discretionary funds, what most parties are doing are prioritizing their kind of top vote champions, or people that are incumbents running for re-election or that have personal political capital that will garner votes. And so in an election where the electors are looking for political renewal, where there's a large discontent from politics as usual, what we anticipate seeing with this electoral fund that's distributed without oversight to its allocation are lower rates of renewal and more, re-election of sitting Congress people. And so one kind of development that has been interesting and we're still kind of following is that there do seem to be a lower level of candidates that have been approved, of candidacies that have been approved by electoral courts than there were in prior elections. So that's kind of surprising. Initial interpretation is that this new 30% fund is not increasing women because we still have 30% women candidates. These are all the numbers. Here it is graphed, right? So we see over time, I'll point to kind of three trends here that you can pick up. And I'll say for each race, it's the percent women candidates and then the percent women elected. So if you look just to the candidate levels, we do see a very slow, gradual, kind of general upward trend in percent female candidates. But then if you look to the elected section, those increases in female candidates are not parlaying into an increase in women elected. We argue that this is an observable implication of the use of laranjas, or these kind of false candidates that are not getting any support from the party. And so we should point out, right, that having more women candidates is not necessarily going to translate into more women elected. One, that progress in women elected is not unidirectional or inevitable in any kind of sense, that there is a possibility for backlash. Another interesting point here is that in no instance, if we look at elected, have any of these offices come anywhere close to the 30% target of the gender quota. And finally, that the race or the office that has the highest proportion of women is the Senate, which has no gender quota. Right? And so this kind of sends us back, to try to figure out what's happening. Again, what we argue is that where there are incentives for this kind of competition within the party list, which is what Brazil's open list proportional representation system induces, then you could imagine that so for example, in the 2014 election, there were 6,822 candidates for the Chamber of Deputies. In Sao Paulo, for one party alone, they had 90 candidates. And so the elector can vote for one person, right? And so you've got, in Sao Paulo, you had 1,200 candidates to choose from. So in that kind of a scenario, there's massive infighting within the party, or kind of intra-party competition. And in such a system, the people that typically rise to the top are those with resources, with individual political capital. And so given the wage discrepancies that we've talked about, that tends not to be women, right? So it is important to say, even as we kind of talk about what these barriers are, it's important to recognize that, it confounds the conventional wisdom in many ways, because Brazil has one of the region's strongest and most dynamic women's movements. Women on factors of education, so 60% of college graduates are women. Women are about half of attorneys or people that recently passed the bar. In Brazil, we've also got women at like 40% in the lower levels of government. We've had this gender quota for quite some time. 80% of the Brazilian electorate says that the country's democracy would improve with more women in office. And throughout the region, there are 7 Latin American democracies that have over 30% women. Right? So the key explanatory factor that we point to is the critical role of political parties, which thus far have been weakly institutionalized and dominated by men and their internal leadership structures who are trying to preserve their own power. And so a key factor for trying to kind of disrupt that norm would be to get more women into the leadership structures of these parties and get access to resources. So unfortunately, when you increase access to you increase the party's access to resources, but you maintain this male-dominant structure within those parties, then they're not going to equitably distribute those resources. And so we will see what happens. We're all kind of, updating, like downloading the TSU data every moment to try to see what's updated. But thus far, it doesn't look rosy, I'll say. So we do hope that with the access to the Electoral Fund, at least there will be less of an incentive for parties to advance laranjas, and that they would be, better able to kind of support the candidacies of women. But we'll see.
Great. Thank you all very much.
Can I just give this one last moment? 2014 was the first time that we had data from the Electoral Court on candidates' self-declared racial identity. So in a country that has an Afro-descendant majority and a female majority electorate, 72% of the parliament are white men. And so having access to data on this has been a political battle that was waged by the Minister for Racial Equality for quite some time. We finally have data, and what we see is that in the Chamber of Deputies, this is the Casa do Povo, or the Representative House of Government, 60% of the candidates are white. Right, so this is yet another source of inequity and access to power, and in future analyses, we'll be looking at the ways in which gender and race intersect to affect political power.
Great. Well, I'm about to open the floor up to questions. But before I do, I actually have one question. I was wondering if the impeachment of former President Dilma Rousseff has had any impact on the way Brazilians view female politicians, if you've seen anything in the data.
So I have a research project on that that I was hoping you would ask this question. So we just got data for this last week, actually. So one of the things that I wanted to emphasize in thinking back to Pedro's and Kristen's comments is that really women's underrepresentation in Brazil is not a consequence of voter biases or voter discrimination. So it's not that biases don't exist. It's that these biases do not detriment women's chances of getting elected. So in other words, women's political underrepresentation in Brazil is much more a consequence of what Kristen was talking about, these challenges of women in accessing resources or gaining party support than in terms of them convincing voters to vote for them. So in thinking about this question of what was the impact of Dilma's impeachment on voters' assessments of candidacies, I've conducted research with my colleague from Oxford, Anna Patrick. I think it's one of the only projects that I don't do with these two. But before, so essentially before we could ask the question about Dilma's impeachment, we had to ask a different question, which was, what is it that voters in Brazil want in their representatives and what is it that they don't want? And that was part of, we had to do that because of the research design, and I'll explain a little bit about the research design for the other project. But basically what we found, we presented voters in Brazil with a list of 25 positive attributes and 25 negative attributes that they might want and not want in politicians, and the extent to which they viewed those attributes as more likely to be present in men or women. And what we see is that for male respondents, positive and negative attributes are more perceived to be present in men. But that negative attributes such as corruption, falsehood, manipulation, unpreparedness, and disloyalty, which were the attributes that they most that they didn't want in politicians, the top ones, those were perceived as much more masculine than the positive attributes like honesty, ethics, character, commitment, and competence. So in other words, of all of the positive and negative attributes, the top ones, the most desirable and the most undesirable, male voters perceived them as more likely to be present in men. That is to say that politics is still perceived by male voters as a male domain. Now, when you turn to female voters, what you see is that they perceived the negative characteristics as more likely to be present in men, but that they perceive these positive characteristics to be more likely to be present in women. And so things like honesty, ethics, the only one was character that it was like, you know, kind of neutral. But women were more, had a more positive view on, about women as candidates. Now, the reason why we did that was that we wanted to, one of the issues of assessing the impact of Dilma's impeachment on the minds of voters is that everyone has been treated in Brazil, right? In other words, every single voter has experienced the impeachment as a process. So if you think about doing experiments or you know, any experimental design, you would, the best, I guess, thing that you would have would either like have everyone who was in coma in Brazil during the impeachment and then woke up afterwards and you know, asking questions to those people versus everyone who experienced the impeachment process. But of course we didn't have that. So what we did was we exposed people, randomly allocated people to a treatment in which they had to assess themselves what the impeachment represented, like what was that. And then we gave them an implicit association test, which is a type of test developed by behavioral psychologists to try to get to people's implicit biases. So if you ask questions in regular surveys to people and say like, are you biased against women? Everyone's gonna be, no, I love women. But so we tried to get this like through an implicit association test, in which basically gives people, you know, asks people to make associations between the positive and negative words that we asked people to rank before, and then whether or not those, and feminine and masculine words for positions. And it basically measures how quickly you associate words, with the idea here being that if you take longer to make associations, you're trying to make your brain, you're trying to correct your biases. And so essentially the longer you take to make connections, the more biased you are. And so anyway, so we did that. And what we find, and these are very preliminary, we just got the data last week, is that men still perceive, there was no difference for men. The treatment didn't have any effect on men. Men still see politics as more likely to be a masculine field. They're more likely to, so here negative numbers are masculine scores. So more likely to perceive men as more capable than women. For women, you see that they perceive politics as more female, so women candidates as more likely to be better than men. However, the impeachment does seem to have had an impact, a negative impact in women's perceptions of women's fitness for office. And so these are things that we'll be looking into more in the next few weeks. But one of the things to say that I think is important is that, especially given the crisis of representation in Brazil and the number of women that are in office right now, people tend to associate politics with bad, and because politics is overwhelmingly male, men with sort of like bad politics. And so we've seen this before in other contexts in which, because women are outsiders, they have sort of like an electoral advantage in a way, just for being political outsiders. Now, once they are incorporated into the system, they may lose this electoral advantage because they start being tainted by politics in and of itself. And so, but I think that in these elections, as Kristen mentioned, you know, there are all of these pressures, especially from incumbents and parties to defend their own places in office. But at the local level, I think that especially in state legislature races, we're seeing a lot of new candidates showing up, and I think that we might see some differences at that level in the composition of legislatures. I'm not very optimistic about national politics in terms of a political renewal, but I think that at the state level, we might see some of these things coming up and people voting for a different sort of political class. So let's see.
And now we're going to have some questions. I think Paulo wants to ask one. Brianna's coming to you with.
No, just two observations on the old. We Brazilians know that Brazilian politics, as Robin said, is not for beginners. So we have in the current picture, the two most likely candidates to go to the second round, and speaking specifically of this issue, are the two that were identified by polls until days ago as the two, how do we say that, Malu, the two least inclined to be appreciated by women voters. So the Bolsonaro and Ciro had very negatives. Another thing that you keep in mind, the running mate for Ciro Gomes, if he manages to get in the second round, it seems to be still true. Whoever, with the exception of Haddad, any candidate that runs against Bolsonaro has a good chance of being elected president. Ciro, Marina, Alckmin. Now, in that scenario, you have Senator Cátia Abreu. Let me just briefly tell you who is Cátia Abreu. Cátia Abreu is a woman who lost her husband at a very young age with 3 kids, raised her family. She's a farmer in the state of Tocantins, and entered politics with a very conservative party, what we call the rural party, etc. She changed her political perspective because of human solidarity. When President Dilma Rousseff, elected President Dilma Rousseff, faced cancer, they, for some reason, got very close, and they remained close. And in the end, you had Senator Cátia Abreu from a very conservative party supporting President Dilma during the impeachment. Okay, who is the candidate that tried to get closer to the Workers' Party and was completely rejected by the Workers' Party in recent weeks, Ciro Gomes. So how complex this thing is that so you may have as future vice president of Brazil a person from a very conservative political party, very close personally to President Dilma, that, by the way, may be elected senator for the PT from the state of Minas, and a PT that has lost a lot of positions recently or influence recently. The fact that the PT is having difficulties moving forward a candidate in the absence of President Lula is very telling. So it will not be an easy picture to assess, although it is the impression right now based on polls. Let's see what polls today and actually tomorrow. We have Datafolha today, Ibope tomorrow, what they say in terms of this rejection of Bolsonaro and probably helping Ciro Gomes potentially becoming president with a vice president that was from a party that until the other day was absolutely opposite to the Workers' Party. So it's a very complex figure. It's not easy to see how, in such circumstances, you put together a governing coalition. And this is the key. But I just wanted to throw it out there because it may become even more confusing if Ciro Gomes is not the second, if he doesn't hold that position. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think to that point, as Pedro mentioned, the people who have been chosen, right, as the vice running mates, I think that is indicative of the need to form a governing coalition, right? They chose women, but they chose women who have deep connections to the government, to the Congress. It'll be interesting to see how that goes.
And a quick clarification that, so in the current Congress, there's 28 parties that have representation, and no president has had more than 20% of the seats among their own party. And so this idea about constructing coalitions is a critical one, and we see that the vice presidents are a way to kind of signal that. Yeah.
Our next question, yes. And if you could just state your name for us and your affiliation.
Yes, Gabrielle Trebot with McClarty Associates. Thank you all for your insights. It's fascinating. I had a two-part question. One, the assassination of Marielle Franco, the Rio City Councilman who was killed earlier this year. Have you seen how, either through your data or your research or even just your interviews, has that impacted at all the discourse on the politics representation, either in this campaign or maybe planting the seeds for future? And second, Paula referenced the high rejection rates for Bolsonaro. Wondering, too, if you've ever seen any breakdown on gender in terms of the rejection rates for Bolsonaro. How many of those are actually women? That'd be interesting to know, too. Thank you.
Malu, did you want to take that one?
Sure. So in terms of Marielle Franco, so actually that's going to be my next paper with Kristen, so watch out for that. But one of the things that we were actually speaking about this morning was that a lot, there have been, and this is like not data, we of course, we haven't been able to look at these data yet. There has been an increase in the candidacies of non-white Brazilians this year, and that includes Black Brazilians and pardos, which is weirdly translated into as brown in English. Anyways, so pardos and pretos, that increased in the proportion of candidacies this year. I think that there's going to be a geographical distribution, perhaps. That's one of the hypotheses. But one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of the people, especially outsiders, Black women and men, in their campaign spots, they have been mentioning Marielle in the campaign spots, and both directly and indirectly. So, for instance, I was watching this spot from a candidate to the federal deputy this morning, and he is speaking, and while he's speaking, there's a poster of Marielle in the back, right? And so there is a symbolic component that I think is very strong, and also this rhetoric of her assassination means that we have to occupy these offices. So what we've been seeing also is that a lot of women who had been elected to city councils in Brazil, Black women, are now running for national politics, and so they're running for higher positions, and that has been an important move, I think. But we'll only be able to fully assess what that means in the future, right? In terms of the candidacies, but then also whether that translates into actual seats.
Let me report to this one data point that we have so far. It's not yet available at the state level, but nationally, across all the candidacies, around 30% are women. If you look at the Preta category, 40% are women, right? So we see a significantly higher concentration of women among Black candidates than we do among the Pardo or Branco Indígena. Right? So it's suggestive, but we can't quite clarify.
So I want to add up just a little bit. I was in Rio specifically for the month of July, doing some work on a future book on Dilma's presidency. And in Rio specifically, there's a clear movement from the Black movement, from the women's movement, the Black movement, of engaging and getting, trying to get more people engaged, especially at the local level. This idea of also the pipeline, getting people elected at the local level to then run for state and then run for national elected positions. So there is like her assassination, definitely, at least in Rio specifically, where she was from, it has mobilized the basis this year. Now, again, we need to see if this is going to continue to the local elections in 2 years. That will be probably the best kind of a data point to see. Will be at local elections what will happen with that with Marielle specifically.
And Marielle's fiance has been very active also in supporting candidates and being politically active, and so that has been really interesting to see as well. In terms of the rejection rate, so we do see a higher rejection among women to Bolsonaro, right? 43% of women say that they would never vote for Bolsonaro, versus 33% of men. We don't know whether this is, I think that this is going to hold up in terms of like higher rejection rates among women towards Bolsonaro versus men. But there has been a bit of a change in rhetoric, I think, since the stabbing. The stabbing of Bolsonaro in a way, and we don't know what's going on. And as Pedro said, perhaps the polls are going to be sort of like temporary. There might be a temporary effect, and then you may lose that. But we have seen a bit of a change in rhetoric in terms of, after the stabbing, people started talking a little bit more about, look, the kinds of things that he defends are actually what's going on, right? So like he is the candidate that is most strongly speaking about public safety, which is a huge topic in the agenda this year. I think it's the main topic on the electoral agenda, and that is something that, in yesterday's debate, Ciro and Marina spoke about it for the first time, and that has been a serious gap in the political agenda and in the campaign. In the policy agendas of all of the candidates except for Bolsonaro. And so the fact that this happened justified very strongly his position on this. And the other thing is that the stabbing was done by this guy who had been in the past affiliated with the Socialist Party. And so that also was used as a rhetoric to say, look, we're trying to go against all of this, all of these terrorist communists that are taking over Brazil, right? But like that was part of the rhetoric too, that we need to elect this guy to fight these dynamics that we're just seeing are actually in place. So.
And to Paulo's point, Pedro?
Yeah, actually, connect to Paulo's point earlier about like the nomination of vice presidential candidates as a strategy for addressing this, the sexist to a certain extent remarks of Bolsonaro and its politics, it is a major gamble for PDT, for Ciro Gomes' party, because Cátia Abreu is from PDT, so there's no coalition arrangement going on there, where the other two, with Haddad and Alckmin, there's clearly a negotiation within coalitions over there. So, as Paulo mentioned, I think it is a gamble to connect to a certain extent to the left-leaning voters and women, hope possibly, who voted for Dilma and were, still supportive of Dilma specifically. But in terms of governability, that can be very problematic if Ciro becomes president, because there'll be even more of a coalition, a negotiation after that.
Bring is access to the so-called BBB caucus, or the Bible, the bullet, and the beef. So these are agribusiness, police, military, and evangelicals. And so, as with a history in agribusiness, she does have significant connections to that caucus, and it is one of the more formidable caucuses, if not the most, within Congress. And so you can imagine in a 28-party Congress, there are kind of creative ways to get policies across. So that's another factor to consider.
Thank you. And I know, Pedro, you're going to have to leave us in just a few minutes, right? All
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
I'll take the next question over here on the left.
Hi, I'm Mariana Prado. I'm a master's student at Georgetown University, and my question is about intersectionality of race and gender, but looking at the voters. You mentioned a little bit about how there's a surge in candidacies by women of color, but how will women of color view voting? Will they support these candidates, or will women in the lower class, who are now Lula's orphans, who are they most likely to support? Thank you.
Who would like to take that?
I don't have data on it. Yeah. I'm
Yeah,
not
I
sure.
mean,
What is Pedro, do you want to?
I don't have any data on that either. That would be all speculation, right?
So I think
It would be speculation. We know that people vote differently at the local level from the national level, right? So I think that at the local level, we might see, again, greater support for these candidates that are coming from Black and women's movements. We're seeing a very different type of campaigning done by women of color at the subnational level, which is really interesting, I think. So one of the things that Kristen mentioned is that because of Brazil's open list proportional representation, candidates are often fighting against each other, right? Against other candidates from their own parties and coalitions. And one of the ways in which women, especially women of color, have been finding to go around this is to run as a collective. And so sometimes you see 10, 15 women running together and saying, look, if one of us wins or two of us wins, we're actually going to govern as a group, and we're going to represent all of our policy agenda together. And so we saw this with Aurea Carolina, for instance, in Belo Horizonte, in which she actually won, and they met regularly to actually decide what she was going to bring up in the city council. And so we're seeing like these more different strategies of campaigning, and that ends up translating into also the way in which you gather voter support, in which you campaign, et cetera. So I think that these dynamics are going to be interesting. And the other thing with the making contributions by corporations illegal, right? What that led to was a much more grassroots movement for campaign. And so that ended up, especially for these left-wing parties, a return in a way to greater involvement with social movements. And so we're seeing that very strongly, especially at the local level. But I'm not answering your question, so.
So to be determined.
Not crossing it with sex. What we see is that the vote intentions for Bolsonaro are significantly lower for people that identify as preto and pardo. But as far as women, I mean, the availability of data is itself a political project, right? So in a country that tries to portray, an image of a racial democracy, getting data that are crossed by gender and race is a political act. So we're working on it.
And the racial equality ministry that just got abolished during this big, it may lead to more problems in the future. More of this political wrangling, deciding what is okay to talk in terms of race. I want to just thank everybody. I have to leave. Unfortunately, I can't stay to the end, but thank you. Thanks a lot, and hope the conversation keeps going there.
We have a question up here in front.
This may also call for speculation,
You
so
could
feel
just
free to.
state your name and your.
I'm Lucy Getman. I'm executive director of an organization called Women in Government, and we work very closely with women political leaders at the state level. And I'm reflecting on some parallels between the two countries in terms of an astonishing increase in the number of women candidates for office, both for Congress, governors, state legislatures, et cetera. But seeing the data on Brazil, it's very clear that for many reasons that doesn't necessarily translate into an increase in the number of women in office. And so feel free to speculate. What do you think will happen in the United States this time around in 2015? And I'll throw that out to everybody around the table.
So it's speculation, right? But the United States comparable to Brazil is a candidate-centered system where one needs to have access to resources in order to run a successful campaign, where the constructed gender gap in political ambition is an issue, where parties claim, women don't want to run and don't ask why, and where race and gender intersect in profound ways. So there are a lot of parallels. The people at the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers have been keen to kind of urge caution at overinterpreting the numbers. We've seen an increase in candidacies from women and men among the Democrats, and less of an increase in candidates among Republican women than what we've seen among Democratic women. But I do think that we'll see an increase in women's representation in the United States. We're at 20%. We're ranked 100 and something, in terms of Brazil's at 152 or 153, and the United States is not much better. So we could all stand to increase representation. So yes, I think that while urging kind of caution at this idea of the Year of the Woman, some renewal is in store here in our elections.
Great. One more question. I think we have time for one or two more. Yes.
Hi, thanks. I'm Rebecca Trickington. I'm the Assistant Director of the Women in Foreign Policy Program at Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much. This is fascinating. I just want to jump off on the comparative point. In the United States, we've seen this rise of women candidates sort of in parallel to a rise of women's organizing in civil society, whether it's in the streets through the Women's March or online through the Me Too movement. Are you seeing a similar rise in Brazil, and how is that translating into political discourse?
Yes, we definitely are seeing an increase in women's mobilization. And so the question that you posed is the important one. What are the conditions under which street power is connoted into ballot power? And so historically, there's been kind of a perception, or a need for distance between social movements and political parties, given the potential for co-optation by parties of social movements. And so they've kind of emerged at an arm's length. And so I think that instances like the assassination of Marielle are really compelling people to cross those lines with more urgency, with a greater sense of urgency. So yes, it's happening. There are very powerful, well-organized Black autonomous feminist groups that have been organizing since 2015 around the country. There was a large march in November of 2015, and as we're seeing, kind of anecdotally, we're seeing stories that these are the women that are running for candidate, and we're toying with this idea of the outraged candidate in both the United States and Brazil, where the cost of sitting it out simply become too large to ignore. And so despite the monumental cost of running a candidacy, that kind of calculation is altered when people's very livelihood or humanity are denied. So that's the next research project. I would love to talk to you further about it, but yeah.
We have a lot of things in the pipeline. But the other thing that I wanted to say is that actually, on top of that, we have a lot of mobilization around the elections in and of themselves, like in and of itself. And so there are quite a few organizations and that are engaging very strongly, especially online, to mobilize women and voters in general to vote for women, and not only to vote for women, but to vote for feminist women. And so, and that extends to feminist bots, to different websites that stress the candidacies of feminist women, et cetera. And so we're seeing this organizing around the elections itself as well.
Because if you're not familiar with Brazilian politics, there is a blockage in terms of renewal of Brazilian politics. It is the political party system in Brazil. And particularly now that politicians have perceived that the system is exhausted, that the system doesn't produce anything particularly good for the country. But they have being a representative, a member of lower house, Senate, the state assembly, city council in Brazil, this is a profession. It runs in families. If you want to see, if I go to a state, the senator is related to the governor, who is related to the congressperson, to the mayor. This is a business. And it is a business because it was built that way. So you don't, there is none of the flexibility and the openness that exists in this society, where you have grassroots movements that are really changing the parameters. Yesterday I heard that more than 100 women may be elected to Congress in this round because everything that is going on here in the United States.
Oh, I'm like,
Huh?
I thought you were talking about Brazil.
No. In Brazil,
Where'd you hear that?
excellent candidates, excellent people, but the system is built. Brazil is a protectionist country in all kinds of ways, starting with trade. But it's protectionist, it's closed. There is a famous samba line that translates, those who are on the outside will not enter, those who are on the inside will not leave. It's a famous song in Brazil, and which doesn't mean that people will not continue to fight, but the system has to change or has to crumble, or something has to give, because under this political system, you can elect a brilliant leader. A brilliant leader will not be able to govern effectively for the good of society. There isn't much room for that. The system is rigged. Sorry for using that term, but it is. And for those who are not familiar with Brazil, the comparisons with the United States just go up to a point. I think there is much more hope, for instance, in the upcoming midterm elections in terms of renewal of Congress, with lots of more women participating.
Yeah. Sure, I just want to say, I mean, is your opinion of the situation in Brazil that bleak in a way? You know, do you think women will make gains?
No, I mean, I think that one of the things is that getting back to Paula's point, right? Like at every electoral cycle, about 80% of congressmen run for re-election in Brazil. And this year, we're seeing people holding on even more strongly to office, especially because one of the benefits of office is that you are protected from persecution, and a lot of people are being investigated. And so they really don't want to lose their seats, right? It's an actual matter of going to prison or not. And so that increased the stakes as well of losing seats, which is why I'm not very optimistic about national politics or renewal at the national level. Because as Kristen mentioned, even though there is this fund now that is supposed to back women's candidacies, we're already seeing very creative ways in which parties are allocating the funds to perpetuate their own power. And so it's like, let's nominate women to vice governors or whatever, and allocate the money for those candidacies, or let's do what they call dobradinhas, which is material that, on one side it prints a woman's face, on the other side it prints a man's face, right? And so like all of those ways in which you would go around the new law.
And we have one more question in back.
My name. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Grab the
Thank
mic.
you. Thanks a lot. Does it work? Oh, yeah. Yeah. My name is Simon Marty. I'm from the Swiss Embassy. I have a question not directly linked to the elections, even though we learned a lot today about the challenges women face when it comes to elections. What about direct democracy in Brazil? Are there elements, aspects of direct democracy, and how do topics that are important for women, how are the outcomes there in that field?
So Brazil, as you may have heard from the question, has been one of the leaders in using participatory budgeting and other forms of participatory governance. We know that when you create these spaces for people to participate, it doesn't come along with the resources that people need to participate. And so often these kind of inequities are just magnified. So who are the people that have time and resources to come sit in a 4-hour budget meeting at night with no childcare to deliberate on the discretionary funding? It tends to kind of reproduce power dynamics, but it's not my exact research area. I know Rebecca Abers has got great research on this.
But one thing to say, and especially, I guess, in the context of Switzerland, well, so first talking about what Kristen was saying, during the Lula government, the PT established these national women meetings that actually sort of watered down to even, it started at the municipal level, and so you would have these meetings in which women would get together at the municipal level, draw up policy plans, and then that would be taken to like state level meetings and then national level meetings, which would influence the national government's agenda in that sense. But in terms of direct democracy, if you think about the Swiss case, I mean, Brazil is very different. I think that the last use of a referendum that we had was years ago on the gun control, right? Was that the last one?
No, there's one case that's very relevant. Right. Initiative laws that are approved by popular initiative. Let me just describe what it is. 2 million people made petitions to make a law proposed to Congress that people that are found guilty of crime in the second instance, meaning by a court of appeals, should be ineligible for office. That is, who signed that into law? President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in 2010. This is precisely the law that is now being applied and keeping him. He is ineligible precisely because of that law. And so it's not a referendum, it's a type of popular initiative that had enormous impact. But you are right on terms of referendum. The last one was about gun control, and it was a non-binding, and the outcome was one that the NRA would be proud of.
But the thing about referendum in Brazil is just that it's super expensive, right? So like you have a huge population, and I think that one of the cool things that I like to talk about elections when I talk about Brazil is actually the voting aspect of it, because I mean, if you think about not only how big the country is, but how remote some areas are, you see all these pictures during election time of the digital machines being taken by boat to some very distant Amazon areas. And so like it's really expensive to conduct elections in Brazil. And so like we can't just have referenda all the time. But I think it's really cool that elections are so inclusionary as well in that sense, that everyone is very close to their voting place. We get voting cards and assigned voting spots, and it's super cool. But anyways.
Thank you. Well, I think on that note, we're out of time for today. I want to thank you all again for coming, and a huge thanks to our panelists, including Pedro Etulivas, but Malu Gato and Kristen Wiley.